Hello everyone, and welcome back to English Spark. We're so happy you're here. Today we have a deeply emotional and inspiring story about love, regret, and second chances. It's the story of a successful man who believed his elderly mother had become a burden and decided to leave her in a nursing home. But before he could carry out his decision, an unexpected event changed his life forever and reminded him that no success in the world is worth more than a mother's love. Sit back, relax, improve your English, and enjoy today's inspiring story. David Carter had always dreamed of becoming successful. Growing up in a small town, he watched other families enjoy comfortable lives while he and his widowed mother struggled to survive. His father had passed away when David was only 6 years old, leaving his mother, Margaret, to raise him alone. She worked long hours cleaning offices during the day and sewing clothes late into the night, just to make sure David had enough food to eat and could stay in school. There were countless nights when Margaret pretended she wasn't hungry so her son could have the last piece of bread. During harsh winters, she wore the same worn-out coat year after year because buying a new one meant she couldn't afford David's school books. She never complained. Every sacrifice she made was accompanied by a smile and the same reassuring words. "One day you'll have a better life than mine." Those words became the fuel that drove David forward. He studied harder than anyone in his class, earned a scholarship to one of the country's best universities, and eventually built a successful technology company that transformed his life. Years passed quickly. David became wealthy, moved into a luxurious home in the city, married a talented architect named Sophia, and welcomed a beautiful daughter named Emma. From the outside, his life looked perfect. Expensive cars filled his garage, business magazines featured his face on their covers, and thousands of employees admired him as a visionary entrepreneur. Yet as his company grew larger, David's time grew smaller. Business meetings replaced family dinners. International flights replaced weekends at home. His phone rang constantly, and every conversation seemed to revolve around profits, investments, and expansion. Meanwhile, Margaret grew older. At first, she remained independent, insisting she could take care of herself. But age slowly began stealing little pieces of her strength. She sometimes forgot where she placed her glasses. Climbing the stairs became painful. Her hands shook while pouring tea. She repeated the same stories without realizing she had already told them. Emma adored spending time with her grandmother, listening to those stories over and over again, but David often became impatient. He loved his mother, yet he convinced himself that his demanding career left no room to care for an elderly parent who now needed constant attention. Sophia tried gently reminding him of everything Margaret had sacrificed, but David always answered the same way. "I'm doing this for our family's future. I can't slow down now." Months later, Margaret accidentally slipped in the kitchen and fractured her wrist. Although the injury healed, she was no longer able to live completely alone. She moved into David's house, hoping only to spend more time with her son and granddaughter. Instead, she found herself feeling like a guest who was afraid of causing inconvenience. She apologized whenever she asked for help, cleaned whatever she could despite her aching joints, and quietly returned to her room whenever David came home looking exhausted. One evening, after another stressful meeting with investors, David walked into the house to find Emma laughing while helping Margaret bake cookies. Flour covered the kitchen, and the cookies were slightly burned, but the room was filled with happiness. Instead of smiling, David frowned. "Emma has homework," he said sharply. "And Mom, you shouldn't be using the oven by yourself." What if something happened? Margaret lowered her eyes and quietly apologized. Emma looked confused. Dad, Grandma was just teaching me your favorite recipe. David sighed impatiently and left the kitchen without tasting a single cookie. Later that night, Sophia found Margaret sitting alone by the window, holding an old photograph of David as a little boy. Tears quietly rolled down her cheeks. I never wanted to become a burden, she whispered. Sophia hugged her gently but didn't know what to say. A few weeks later, David attended a business dinner where several executives discussed balancing work and family. One of them casually mentioned how relieved he felt after moving his elderly father into a luxury nursing home. Best decision I ever made, the man laughed. Professional care, medical staff, activities all day. And I finally got my freedom back. The idea settled into David's mind. First he rejected it, but the more pressure he felt at work, the more reasonable it seemed. He began researching high-end nursing homes, convincing himself it would actually improve his mother's quality of life. He told himself she would make friends, receive better medical care, and enjoy professional attention that he simply couldn't provide. Deep down, however, another voice whispered the truth. He wasn't doing it for her. He was doing it because it was easier for him. One Saturday morning, David visited one of the finest nursing homes in the city. The building was beautiful with gardens, libraries, and cheerful staff members welcoming every visitor. The director proudly showed him elegant rooms and smiling residents participating in games and music sessions. Everything appeared perfect. David nodded politely while imagining his mother's belongings inside one of those quiet rooms. Before leaving, the director handed him an admission form and smiled warmly. Whenever you're ready, she said, we'll take excellent care of her. David folded the papers, placed them inside his briefcase, and drove home convinced he had made the right decision. That evening, while cleaning the living room, Emma accidentally found the admission papers after they slipped from David's bag. Curious, she picked them up and slowly read the words at the top of the page. Residential care admission form. She didn't fully understand what the documents meant, but when she asked her father about them, he answered without thinking. Grandma is getting older. She'll be moving somewhere people can look after her. Emma's smile disappeared. She looked toward Margaret's bedroom before quietly asking the question David would never forget. Dad, when you get old, will you want me to send you away too? David stood completely still after hearing Emma's question. The room fell silent, and for the first time in years, he had no answer. He forced a small smile and gently changed the subject, but Emma's innocent words echoed in his mind long after she had gone to bed. Later that night, he found Margaret quietly folding laundry in her room. She smiled as he entered, pretending not to notice the nursing home papers still visible inside his briefcase. You work too hard, she said softly. Don't forget to rest. David nodded absent-mindedly, unable to meet her eyes. Over the next few days, he became even more determined to carry out his plan, convincing himself that guilt was only a natural reaction to making a difficult but necessary decision. He scheduled the move for the following Monday without telling his mother. Sophia noticed the appointment written on his calendar, and tried once more to change his mind. David, she said gently, your mother spent her whole life making sacrifices so you could become the man you are today. Are you sure this is how you want to thank her? David sighed heavily. I'm not abandoning her. She'll have doctors, nurses, friends. She'll be safer there than here. Sophia looked at him sadly. Maybe. But what she needs most isn't a beautiful building. It's her son. David said nothing. The weekend arrived, and Margaret seemed unusually cheerful. She spent hours with Emma planting flowers in the garden, telling stories about David's childhood. She laughed as she described how he used to cry whenever he lost his favorite toy, and how he insisted on sleeping beside her during thunderstorms because he was afraid of the dark. Emma listened with sparkling eyes while David watched from the kitchen window. For a brief moment, he almost tore up the admission papers. But then his phone rang. Another emergency meeting. Another business crisis. The feeling disappeared as quickly as it had come. Early Monday morning, David loaded a small suitcase into the trunk of his car. Margaret noticed immediately but didn't ask any questions. She simply smiled, put on her old coat, and climbed into the passenger seat. During the drive, she admired the passing trees and quietly thanked David for taking time away from work to spend the morning with her. Every word she spoke made the journey harder, but David kept his attention fixed on the road. Halfway there, dark clouds gathered overhead, and heavy rain began falling. Visibility quickly became poor. As they approached a mountain highway, traffic slowed because of the weather. David tightened his grip on the steering wheel while Margaret looked out the window. "This reminds me of the day I took you to your first day of school," she said with a warm smile. "You were so scared that you refused to get out of the car. You held my hand and asked if I'd still be waiting when school ended. I promised I would never leave you." David forced a weak smile but remained silent. Seconds later, a truck traveling in the opposite direction suddenly lost control on the wet road. Everything happened in an instant. Tires screeched. Drivers shouted. Cars swerved wildly to avoid the truck. David instinctively turned the steering wheel, but the vehicle spun across the slippery highway before crashing violently into a roadside barrier. The impact was deafening. Airbags exploded. Glass shattered everywhere. For several terrifying seconds there was only silence. David slowly opened his eyes. His head throbbed and blood trickled down his forehead. He tried moving but felt trapped beneath the damaged steering wheel. Panic filled his chest. "Mom!" he shouted. There was no answer. He turned toward the passenger seat and saw Margaret leaning motionless against the deployed airbag. "Mom!" he cried again, struggling desperately to reach her. Just then he noticed something that made his heart stop. During the crash, Margaret had thrown her own body across him. Her frail arms were still wrapped around his shoulders, shielding him from the worst of the impact. The side of the car where she had been sitting was crushed almost beyond recognition. Firefighters and paramedics arrived within minutes, cutting through the twisted metal to free them. As David was carried to an ambulance, he kept asking the same question over and over. "Is my mother okay? Please, tell me she's okay." No one answered immediately. Doctors rushed Margaret into emergency surgery while David sat in the hospital corridor with shaking hands, his expensive suit stained with blood and rainwater. Hours felt like years. Every second was filled with unbearable guilt. Memories flooded his mind one after another. His mother walking miles to take him to school because she couldn't afford bus fare. Staying awake all night sewing clothes to pay his tuition. Selling her wedding ring so he could buy his first laptop. Working through illness without ever complaining. And now, even after everything, she had instinctively risked her own life to save his. David buried his face in his hands and broke down in tears for the first time since he was a child. A surgeon finally stepped into the waiting room. His expression was serious. "Your mother is alive," he said quietly. "But the next 24 hours will be critical." David closed his eyes in relief, only for the doctor to continue with words that pierced his heart. "Before she lost consciousness, she asked us to promise that if anything happened to her, we shouldn't blame you, because she knew you were only trying to do what you believed was best." Those words shattered whatever remained of David's certainty. For the first time, he realized that even after discovering his plan, his mother had never been angry. She had only continued loving him. David spent the entire night sitting beside the intensive care unit, unable to sleep, eat, or think about anything except the woman lying unconscious behind the glass. Every machine connected to Margaret reminded him how close he had come to losing the person who had never stopped protecting him. Business calls flooded his phone throughout the day, but for the first time in years he ignored every one of them. His assistant left dozens of messages about urgent meetings, nervous investors, and contracts that needed his approval, yet none of it seemed important anymore. He stared through the hospital window and remembered moments he had forgotten long ago. He remembered being 8 years old and waking up with a high fever. Margaret had carried him on her back through heavy rain because she couldn't afford a taxi. He remembered complaining that his classmates had newer clothes, only to discover years later that his mother had secretly skipped meals for weeks to buy him the jacket he wanted. He remembered graduating from university and proudly thanking his professors, his friends, and his business partners during his speech, while forgetting to thank the woman who had made every one of those achievements possible. The realization crushed him. For years he had believed he had built his success alone, but every step of that journey had been supported by invisible sacrifices made by his mother. Late that evening, a nurse approached him carrying a small cloth bag that had been found among Margaret's belongings after the accident. "She always kept this with her," the nurse said gently. "We thought you might want to have it." David slowly opened the bag. Inside were dozens of old photographs, his first school report card, a tiny toy car with missing wheels, a faded drawing he had made in kindergarten that simply read, "I love you, Mom," and a newspaper clipping from the day his company became successful. Every item had been carefully protected as though it were priceless. At the bottom of the bag was a worn notebook. Curious, David opened it. It was a diary. The first pages dated back more than 20 years. Margaret had written about David's first day of school, his first football match, his first broken heart, and every birthday she had celebrated with him. There were hundreds of entries. Some spoke about difficult days when they had barely enough money to buy food. Others described moments of joy when David smiled after receiving good grades. One sentence appeared again and again throughout the diary. "As long as my son is happy, I have everything I need." David continued reading until he reached the most recent pages. His hands began trembling. Margaret had written about moving into his house. She described how proud she was of the successful man her son had become. She also admitted feeling lonely sometimes because he was always busy, but she never blamed him. Then David found the final entry, written only 2 days before the accident. "I accidentally saw the nursing home papers today. At first, my heart hurt more than I can describe. Then I remembered the little boy who used to hold my hand because he was afraid of the dark. That little boy is still somewhere inside the busy man he has become. I don't want him to feel guilty. If living somewhere else gives him peace, I will go with a smile. A mother's job is to make life easier for her child, no matter how old he becomes." Tears streamed down David's face, soaking the pages. He realized that while he had been searching for a way to make his own life easier, his mother had been searching for a way to protect him from guilt. The next morning, the doctor informed David that Margaret had finally regained consciousness. With trembling legs, he entered her room. She looked weak, surrounded by medical equipment, but when she saw her son, she smiled exactly as she always had. "You're safe," she whispered. "That's all I prayed for." David fell to his knees beside her bed. Unable to control his emotions, he took her fragile hands in his own and cried like a little boy. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I forgot everything you did for me. I forgot who stood beside me every time I fell. I was going to send you away, and you still risked your life to save mine." Margaret gently wiped the tears from his face with her trembling hand. "You don't have to apologize," she whispered. "Life becomes noisy sometimes. People lose their way. What matters is finding the road back." David shook his head. "No. I need you to hear this. There will be no nursing home. Ever. My home is your home. I want Emma to grow up knowing the incredible woman who raised me. I want every day I have left with you to remind me how lucky I am to still call you my mother." Margaret smiled through her own tears and softly squeezed his hand. Outside the hospital room, Sophia and Emma watched the reunion in silence. Emma looked up at her mother and smiled. "Grandma is coming home with you, isn't she?" Sophia nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she whispered. "She's finally coming home." David kept every promise he had made beside his mother's hospital bed. After Margaret was discharged, he brought her home himself, not as someone who needed to be cared for out of obligation, but as the heart of the family. He transformed the first floor into a comfortable living space, so she would never have to struggle with stairs again. Every morning before leaving for work, he sat beside her with a cup of tea, listening to the stories he had once been too busy to hear. Sometimes they laughed together over old memories. Sometimes they simply enjoyed the silence. For David, those quiet moments became more valuable than the biggest business deals he had ever signed. His company also began to change. He delegated responsibilities, trusted his leadership team, and stopped believing that success required sacrificing the people he loved. His employees quickly noticed the difference. Instead of measuring success only by profits, David introduced family-friendly policies, flexible working hours, and paid leave for employees who needed to care for elderly parents. During a company meeting, he stood before hundreds of workers and spoke from the heart. "For years," he admitted, "I believed success meant earning more money, building a bigger company, and working longer hours. But I was wrong. True success is coming home to the people who waited for you when you had nothing." His speech spread across social media, inspiring millions of people around the world. Journalists praised his honesty, but David always smiled and replied with the same sentence. "I didn't change because I became wiser. I changed because my mother loved me more than I deserved." Emma became even closer to her grandmother. Every weekend they baked cookies together using the same recipe David had once ignored. This time he joined them. The kitchen filled with laughter, flour covered the counters, and even when the cookies burned, no one cared. Those simple afternoons became the happiest memories of their lives. Margaret also began writing in her diary again. One evening, while she rested in the garden watching Emma play, David quietly asked if he could read the new pages one day. Margaret smiled. "Only after I'm gone," she said gently. "Some words are meant to become gifts for the future." Years passed peacefully. Margaret grew older, but she was never lonely again. She attended Emma's school performances, celebrated birthdays surrounded by family, and watched her granddaughter grow into a kind young woman. One autumn afternoon, Margaret fell asleep peacefully in her favorite chair with a gentle smile on her face and never woke up again. She left this world exactly as she had lived in it, with love and quiet dignity. At her funeral, hundreds of people came to pay their respects. Former neighbors, old friends, company employees, and even strangers whose lives had been touched by David's public speeches stood together in silence. When it was David's turn to speak, he unfolded the final pages of Margaret's diary. His voice trembled as he read her last written words. "If my son ever reads this, I want him to know that I never measured my life by the money we had or the hardships we faced. My greatest success was watching the little boy I raised become a good man. If he smiles when he remembers me, then I have lived a beautiful life." David could no longer hold back his tears. Looking toward the sky, he whispered, "You didn't just give me life, Mom. You taught me how to live it. Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I almost gave up on you." From that day forward, David created the Margaret Carter Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting elderly people who had been abandoned or left without family. Thousands of seniors found care, companionship, and hope through the foundation, and every building carried the same message at its entrance. No one who once carried you should ever have to walk alone. Whenever David visited the foundation, he greeted every elderly resident with the same respect. He wished he had shown his own mother sooner. Years later, when Emma became an adult and started her own family, she often told her children the story of their great-grandmother. She ended every telling with the lesson that had changed her father's life forever. Never wait until tomorrow to show love to the people who loved you first, because tomorrow is a promise that no one can make. And every time David heard those words, he smiled through grateful tears, knowing that although his mother was no longer beside him, her love continued to guide generation after generation. In the end, David discovered that wealth can build houses, but only love can build a home. And among all the treasures a person can possess, the greatest blessing is still having a mother whose prayers follow you long after her voice has fallen silent. Thank you so much for listening to this inspiring story. We hope it touched your heart while helping you improve your English through storytelling. If this story inspired you, please give this video a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us what lesson you learned from David's journey. Don't forget to subscribe to English Spark and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring English story. Keep learning, keep growing, and most importantly, never forget to cherish the people who love you the most. See you in the next story.